Alright, how's everyone doing tonight? How many of you, by show of hands, actually know some of the rules of NFL football and some penalties, most common penalties? How many don't really know or don't know anything about them? Alright, well, that's what I'm here for you guys. And for the guys that know, they can interact with the rules I'm talking about. Football, for me, is a big part of my life. I grew up watching it, playing it. I played high school. But other than that, I just always had a passion for it and like talking about sports. And you picture. The first rule, the most common rule they made is a concussion rule, which has been a problem in the past probably 50 years. In 2010, they didn't make a new rule, but they expanded on the rule of the concussion for defenseless players, and how defenders more than offensive players lead with the helmet hits to the offensive player, which leads to concussion, which leads to you're out for a while, or the best case scenario, only like a week. There's a protocol in the NFL for concussion. You have to take numerous tests, which takes about a week. And if it's minor, you can come back and play next week. And if it's longer, then you have to do the following week. If you fail the test, you have to take another test and keep going there until you pass it, unless you do already pass it. My personal experience, I suffered one concussion, and it sucks because concussions is when the brain rattles pretty fast around the walls of your skull, and that leads to dizziness. You either get headaches, you can throw up right at the spot, or it leads on hours after, days after. That's how they find out you have a concussion. But a study done by Garth Shanklin that wrote this article, in 2011, there was about 197 cases of concussions of players that were injured. And in 2012, it jumped up to 217. So basically, the rule is the rule. It works, but in reality, it doesn't, because there's been more concussion injuries the past several years. But leading to the new rule, more players are actually going, instead of up high, they're going low, below the waist, more at the knees. And that's a concern for the quarterbacks mostly, and for other players, because it leads to ACL and MCL injuries in the knee. And that can, unlike concussions, you can be out for a week if it's minor, but for ACL, MCL tear, you're pretty much done for a whole year, and because the rehab process takes like about 9 months. That being said, former players now found that they have CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. There's a picture of a on the top left, that's a normal brain cell, and that's the CTE brain cell, which means the brain cells die over the course of your years. It doesn't come up right away. It can be found 10, 20, 50 years after a player is done, and that leads to depression, aggression, anxiety. Those are the most common signs and symptoms that a player has. But a lot of players, doctors find out when a player is deceased. They find in their brain, they go back and find that they actually had CTE, which causes sometimes players, a former player, Junior Seau, actually committed suicide because he had, they found out he had CTE after he did it to study the brain. He had depression problems, they found out. So that can cause a player to commit suicide, or just have depression problems. They can't get on their feet after football when it's all said and done. And a study done by Boston EDU, they examined 79 former players' brains, and 76 had CTE. So the concussion rate is going high, and the CTE is even worse for former players. And lastly, I'm going to talk about some common penalties in the NFL. A false start and offsides is pretty much the same kind of penalty, but it's a different terminology. False start is when an offensive player crosses the line before the ball snap, and that results in a 5-yard penalty. But offsides is when a defensive player crosses the line of scrimmage and hits a offensive player, which results in a 5-yard penalty. So penalties aren't major, but they're just different terminologies. For holding, there's offensive holding and defensive holding. Offensive holding is when a lineman or another offensive player holds a defensive player from trying to pursue the ball quarterback or the ball carrier runner. Even if it's a wide receiver, you can do defensive holding, which results in just a 5-yard penalty. That's a picture of a offensive holding. Even though he could get 10, 20, even score a touchdown, just because of that move right there, that's an offense. It results in a 10-yard penalty. That's when the offender holds the defender. So the offensive holding is way more worse than a defensive holding because it can take back a big run or a big play or even a touchdown and go back even losing 10 yards over that line of scrimmage. And then a defensive pass interference is when the defender holds on to the receiver, most likely, which would be the receiver that gets called for it. They would hold on to them or push them before they even have a chance to play on the ball, and that results in a 15-yard penalty and like an automatic first down. And offensive holding is pretty much the opposite, same penalty, but that's when the offensive player pushes the defensive player out of the way to try to catch the ball. That's interfering with the defender, which is obviously an advantage for the wide receiver at that point. And I have some statistics that just in 2014 alone, for false start penalties, which is the lineman usually is they got called for about 600 false starts, and offsides for defense was only about 200. So man, you can figure it out. Offensive players aren't really disciplined. They like to jump first, then defender. And the pass interference for defense was about 200 to about 100 offensive pass interference because the defender wants to do everything they can to try to get an advantage, to try to get an interception, block the ball down from the receiver catching it. For offensive holding, there was about 400, and defensive holding, there was about 300 calls. So those are pretty the same. The only big difference was the false starts to the offsides. So, saying that, I went over the concussions and how you can get CTE from concussions, and went over the most common penalties in the game. And I hope everyone learned something that they didn't really know at first.